the Social and Community Service Employees Forum. So obviously you just attended the Health and Allied and Management and Admin, and now we're moving on to the Social and Community Services stream. So my understanding is that all of our members have people employed in that classification. So in terms of the forum, we're a little bit late in terms of implementation. The agreement did commence to operate on the 23rd of October 2018, and it was also approved with undertakings. So you might note that the agreement actually expired in 2015, and why did it take so long? And really that was related to the equal remuneration order and the back pay, which caused a delay. So the equal remuneration order is quite a complex process, and it took a while for us to work out a wage proposal related to it to be able to put forward to the ASU. The ASU didn't like the original proposal and still tried to seek more, but obviously in the end that was rejected by members because there's the significant costs that the ERO already cost members, and the EBA we had to offer slightly above. So it took a while to also get employers on board to that proposal, because it was quite a hard explanation to say, well, there's actually a difference between the agreement and the ERO. A big portion of what was agreed ended up actually being the ERO, and then obviously Fair Work has quite a large time frame for getting an agreement approved, and then we had to go through the process of doing undertaking. So in terms of how I'm going to do this forum, it's slightly different to the Health and Allied, and I've incorporated it into my slides because I've had a fair amount of time to do this stuff. The undertakings, I'm going to deal with them throughout the presentation rather than upfront. So you might be questioning, well, what is the ERO? So the ERO is the Equal Remuneration Order, and a decision was made by the Fair Work Commission in 2012 where a full bench, 3 of 4, decided that there was not equal pay when you compare the pay rates for social and community service employees, when you compare them to women and men in government and local council organisations, and they found that the gender and the female gender actually was a large part of causing that gap. So they decided to say, okay, well, there's not equal pay, we'll provide you with equal pay. And it was in relation to the Social, Community, Home Care and Disability Services Industry Award, which is what we call the underpinning modern award for SACS employees. So if we didn't have the SACS agreement, that's where you would get your terms and conditions from. Obviously that doesn't apply, but your enterprise agreements, every enterprise agreement still has to interact with modern award wage rates. I think it is section, I can't remember quite the section, I think it's section 206 of the Fair Work Act says you must meet minimum wages in your relevant modern award. So the agreement is comprehensive, but we need to make sure you're paying minimum wages. So what they decided was that for SACS level 2 to 8, there was a range of increases on a sliding scale of 23% at the level 2, ranging up to 45% for the level 8s. So from that decision came the order itself, which is known as the ERO, and that's where that comes from. So because of the large increases, which you saw was 23% to 45%, it's quite a lot. What the Commission decided to do was to make it payable over 9 instalments to help, the financial pressure of the significant increases. So for example, in 2012, it was the first instalment was due. In 2013, the second instalment was due. And when we get to 2020, the last 9th instalment is due. And then they also decided that your Fair Work minimum wage would also still increase the modern award wages, and it would also change the ERO. So the reason why they did that is because if they said you get a 45% increase, but we'll absorb the minimum wages, well, you're really not getting a 45% increase. So that's why you had to then continue to do a July increase. So because, this is a bit of a background for the to when we get to the wages, but that's why under the previous SACS agreement, you were getting staff, most, not all, but most staff would have ended up getting a 2 increases a year. One in July as a result of the Fair Work minimum wage and one in December as a result of the ERO. So the last dot point is where the complexity comes into it. Is the Fair Work Commission said, well, we know that you come from a range of different pre-modern awards in different sectors. Your pre-modern award may be higher than the modern award wage rate. Well, what we don't want to do is freeze you and wait till the modern award catches up. We want you to still get the increases, but you will get a smaller increase because you're closer to that end payment. So I know that's complicated. So I did make up a bit of an example on I did it in a spreadsheet, put it into Word. But you can see here, I've got the red line is for someone where you might say the modern award, the pre-modern award is higher than what the modern award is. So say the modern award with no ERO is $1,000. And then under the person's pre-modern award, they were getting $1,200. So I've entered them in the sheet there sitting at $1,200 in 2012. But then you've also got, say, someone that is a welfare worker that goes to the same social and community services level. So you're both going to level 8, but because you came from a different place, you will still both get increases, but as you can see, there's actually a larger gap for the person that was on $900 to make its way up to the ERO with the 45%, which is basically 1,450. So you can see the green, where the pre-modern award was lower, you get your ERO on top of that. And then with the social worker, you still get it, but it's a smaller gap. So you still receive it, but you'll receive smaller amounts because the gap is smaller compared to someone where you have to make it up to the modern award. So what the Fair Work Commission could have done in a particular instance, they could have said, okay, well, you social worker, let's freeze your $1,200 and we'll freeze it until you meet up with the green line, which say in this example would be actually somewhere in 2019. They said, well, we don't want to do that because you're not going to get an increase for a while. We'll give it to you, but a smaller increase. So this is the complicated fact around why we have to do a notional translation, and that's just the way they did it. We weren't involved in it, some other employer bodies were, but it's really to say no disadvantage, essentially. So it's something that we can't get rid of, and we weren't able to get rid of in the bargaining, but that's just a bit of a history on how the ERO works. It doesn't get into real detail on the calculations, but it just shows you that even though people go to the end point right now, they're at the same end point, people will have different wages. So people, if employers come to you and they compare and they say, well, you're on a different salary, but we're all SACS level 8 pay point 3. You say, well, look, we have to look at your pre-modern award. That actually, both of those determine what your wage rate is. So whichever is the higher is what your ERO instalment is based on. So the next, I'm just going to take it through the parts of the EBA and go through it in that kind of order. So the first one is part 1, which really contains the mechanical clauses of the enterprise agreements. The flexible working arrangements is a new clause, but it's intended to reflect Section 65 of the Fair Work Act, where people can ask for flexible working arrangements in particular circumstances. There's a process where you have to reply within 21 days, and then also you might request to meet with the employee to talk about the request itself. You might need to clarify. You also could respond with an alternative and talk about alternatives, and then also your reasons for refusal. So it's intended to reflect the Act and just remind people that there is that entitlement that you need to make sure you're working through for people in those particular circumstances. I haven't listed them there, but they're in Section 65. It's not a comprehensive clause, so you still have to read it in conjunction with. The next one is the IFA, which is an individual flexibility arrangement. That's slightly different, and it was pre-existing, but we had to do an undertaking. So the difference between the IFA is like changing things such as overtime or leave loadings because people are better off overall. So it might be that you want someone to work a particular time and they don't get overtime for that or a shift penalty, but because of their family life responsibilities, they might say to you, well, no, I actually want to work these hours to do my work. You don't want that to happen because they're going to get a penalty, but they feel that that hour is going to work in better with their work-life responsibility. They can put that's better for them. So that's the difference between the two. It's slightly different in terms of amounts versus like flexible working arrangements might be, you know, a reduction of part-time hours or something like that. We did have to do an undertaking, and that's in relation to the notice period that's required. The EBA has what's required in the Modern Award, which is 13 weeks, but it's actually no more than 28 days. If you make a request to cancel it, it's no more than 28 days notice for an employee or an employer. It doesn't stop parties mutually agreeing to it, but if one party just wants to terminate it, no more than 28 days notice. So that's just important to note. The next clause is the dispute resolution. It's similar to the health professionals agreement, but we did some tweaking. The agreement has examples of workplace grievances. So in terms of history, the SACS agreement is quite different to other enterprise agreements. When you went to the previous dispute resolution clause, it actually didn't, it said you can bring a workplace grievance. It didn't actually define it. We tried to change it and make it clearly defined about what type of grievance was applicable. It wasn't agreed by the union, but we did put some examples in it, but it says not limited to. But some of the examples are a dispute under the NES, a dispute under the agreement, flexible working arrangement and disciplinary procedures. So we're hoping that at least confining it to some examples, people will get an idea that you can't just take a grievance about, you know, tea and biscuits to the commission or raise a dispute locally. So some improvement, not quite there yet, but at least a bit of a better improvement. There's an internal process that we put a time limit on as 14 days, but it can also be reasonably extended with the parties if you need further time by agreement. And then there's also just some more information about the process with Fair Work Commission, which includes resolution through conciliation if you can't resolve it locally, and then arbitration if that fails, and then also early referral for collective disputes. But with collective disputes, you still have to try to have reached a mutually, you know, agreeable circumstance before. You have to still try at the local level. You can't just have a union come to you and say, well, because it's a local dispute, we want to go to the commission. No, you have to generally attempt to resolve it, which is, yeah, part of dispute resolution. If you think they're not, call them out on it. Call them out if you don't think they're actually generally trying to agree is something that we always recommend. If they haven't done the step, they'll write you a letter and they'll say, well, you know, we've met our thing by writing this letter, it's lodged a grievance, but you're actually required to meet. So they're just some tips in terms of trying to get something sorted. Then the next one is consultation. Again, it's similar to the health professionals agreement. So this is where we try to start to get some consistency in the clauses. And one is a definition of consultation. So lots of people misinterpret what consultation is. So we put the definition in there. And the definition is a genuine opportunity to influence the decision maker, not joint decision making. So it's not up to the employees to make the decision for you, but they can clearly influence you, have particular ideas that you may or may not take into account. So it's just making sure people know that that's what consultation is, and it comes from a Fair Work decision. We've got a revised list of when consultation is to occur. So we made some improvements from the health professionals, which includes like when you might need to relocate or redeploy someone by location. If you don't have, if you have flexibility built into your contract, it technically doesn't fit a significant effect as a minimum term, whereas other ones it just does. So it's some flexibility, and that's where you might have people that rotate around different receptionist roles that you might have like that. I'm giving a bad example because SACS employees don't do it, but I've had that before in terms of, you know, receptionists moving around different clinics and all that type of stuff. So then there's also a provision of a change impact statement and meeting. That's something that people usually do. So that should be just updating provision of change impact statement. Adding examples of measures to mitigate and avert, so just providing examples such as redeployment, salary maintenance. They obviously don't have to occur, but they're just examples to help provide people with what the relevant options are. And it's also, the list in there isn't exhaustive as well, but they're some of the items. The next one is outcome of consultation. So that's probably something that people generally didn't do or don't do. It wasn't specific that you had to do it, but really it was making sure that once your consultation has occurred, you let people know, well, is the change going ahead? What has changed? If something has been taken into account in terms of items that people have raised, what that is and how it's been taken into account. Because obviously it changes. It's not just this is the change and that's it. It is an opportunity for people to influence, which means you don't always, but get a different outcome to what you put out. So clarity about what the finished product is what that is about. So then the next one is part 3 of the agreement. It covers types of employment, transition to retirement, termination of employment, and redundancy. So one of the last changes that we did was part-time hours with the employees to make it clear. So this was a particular issue for the ASU. Really, this should set out the general principles that we would use in terms of a part-timer. You agree that they've got particular hours, but they can be offered additional ordinary hours within the limits prescribed, like your 38 hours or 76. That if they say work one shift of 5 hours, you might say, well, can you please work an additional second shift of 5 hours that's ordinary? They're entitled to decline that because obviously their original contract with you is the 5 hours. And if they agree, then obviously that would be paid at ordinary pay. Where they don't agree, then you would have to direct them as long as it's reasonable overtime. So there's a lot of factors in the NES that describe what you would look at. And where they declined and you direct them and they do it, it's reasonable overtime. The only exclusion there is that last dot point where if someone is already working a shift, so say if they're working 5 hours, they're rostered for 5 hours or 5 hours is their normal working day, and you say, look, you've got to stay back and you've got to work till a further 3 hours. Any of that 3 hours would be overtime because it's in addition to what they've already started to work. It's that battle between, well, they don't really have as much of an option when you're kind of saying to them, well, we need you to stay back to do this work. There's less of a reason to decline, so we've got that in there as an automatic type thing. And it's when they've started the shift. Then they've already started the shift. So the next one we also added, which is new, is a clause regarding additional appointments. This is really where you might have people, and it doesn't happen in all, but some, working 2 or more roles. So it also provides a definition that really is about them being demonstrably separate and distinct. Now, I don't think there's been any cases since we've done it, but the reason for putting that in there is that you can't just claim someone is going to work all these extra hours and not get paid overtime because you're just saying, well, they're separate and distinct. They have to be separate and distinct roles. It would be like you're a social worker, you're a welfare worker. You're doing different types of work. And then that the calculations are treated separately. You also have to, under the calculations being treated separately, tell them information about, well, how is their role delineated, make it clear what their different pay rates are and when they are going to do that work. So that's in terms of transparency when you start them in those roles, so people are not confused about, oh, well, no, I think I'm working 10 hours in that one and then 4 hours in that one, but I was never told, but that's what I'm doing. So making it clear and transparent at the start so you don't have disputes later. That's what that is about, and just making sure that the hours are reasonable, taking into account section 62 of the Act. There's also, it's a clear statement because some employers were worried that there's no obligation for you to appoint someone in dual roles because I know some employers don't do it as a policy. This doesn't stop that from occurring. So then the next one is the casual conversion. Which is something that I'm not sure if it's in all of the agreements, but it's definitely in the SACS agreement, where an employer or an employee can request to convert casual employment to your full-time or part-time, which might also include fixed-term employment. So what's important is that it's a request either way. It's not just one-sided as an employee, which is usually what the union likes. We made sure it's got that balance, but you have to make sure it's not unreasonably refused, which you'll take into a lot of circumstances. It applies where a casual is rostered on a regular and systematic basis over 26 weeks, and don't apply to someone where their hours belong to someone else. So that might be because they're working hours because of long service leave, parental leave, or also someone that might be on half parental leave, or they're doing a flexible work arrangement. So when it's not free hours, it won't apply to the casual conversion. There's also some extra information about the continuous service and how you treat that. So any regular and systematic service will count for the purposes of service, but you don't get full-time or part-time employment until you've actually converted. So that means, like, say for example, redundancy pay, if they had six months where they, say they were say they were 6 months regular and systematic, and then they went to 8 months, another 8 months, you'd count the 6 months and the 8 months, which would take you to a year where they would get a redundancy pay. Whereas if you only technically counted the part-time employment, they wouldn't have, because they're under 1 year. So that's just the circumstance where it talks about that. The next one is the parental leave replacement. So it just specifically covers the process for when you're engaging someone in parental leave, which is really about notification. So that includes telling a person that you're a parental leave replacement. And then the entitlement to return. So that might be that the incumbent is entitled to return to their position, or that person may be seconded into a particular role. So when they've finished their secondment, they will go back to their original role after the parental leave replacement returns. How it will end, so that's about, well, it'll end by a fixed date, or it will end when the other person returns, or a combination of both, which is known as a maximum term. So there are a few options that you can do in relation to that. And then the last dot point is about expected time frame. So what's the time frame on that replacement, and any changes that might be made. And really, there's meant to be a commitment that if there are any changes, you would communicate them 4 weeks before the change. So that's just a bit of a timeline. It doesn't say you have to, but you need to be able to say, look, we'll commit to providing you, 4 weeks notice if anything changes, or if you are terminating, then it's finishing in line with that contract. So that gives people a heads up. The next one is transition to retirement. This is a new clause, and it's really about an option to agree. It doesn't have anything in there about it not unreasonably being refused. So it's not technically an entitlement, but it allows you with the flexibility to agree to an arrangement with someone that's over the age of 55 and is going to retire. So it provides you examples of transition to retirement, which is like a reduction in hours. It could be a job share arrangement. Then it also talks about how it can be implemented, which could be through flexibility arrangement, the IFA, or just something in writing. And what you just need to do is make sure it's all clear, because you don't want to have a dispute later. That's talking, making it clear is what's important. And then in addition, it just says that you can use long service leave, annual leave and purchase leave as options to help a transition to retire. So for annual leave and long service leave, example is someone works 5 days, they agree with their manager, because they have a long period of annual leave, that they can have three days work and then 2 days annual leave ongoing, versus having to have a whole chunk off work. So that's just examples of what you can do with that clause and what you can agree to. The next one is the changes to redundancy. So the redundancy payment used to, and this comes from a lot of the old awards, at 10 years, it used to drop to 12 weeks continuous service. And that was because it was saying, well, you get your long service leave at that time, so it should reduce, which is a bit outdated. So we've agreed to keep it at the 16 weeks, so it doesn't go backwards. So that's just a payroll thing to be aware of, and that's also providing some consistency with what was agreed in the health professionals, because a lot of these terms, and SACs in terms of their benchmark of where their entitlements were quite backwards when you compare them to other enterprise agreements. So a lot of things might be, say, new in here, but really it's transitioning to something where you can kind of say, well, we're getting closer to consistency on particular items, and this is one of those that kind of makes sense to do. The next one is alternative to redundancy. This was the bigger change, and it may or may not be what people do, but I saw it as quite a significant change in terms of the first step is, well, can you consider alternatives other than redundancy, which is things such as job sharing, natural attrition, so just letting it happen as it flows, or also a voluntary reduction of hours or voluntary departure packages. So then obviously reasonable redeployment if that's appropriate, which means you'll need to identify to employees what those are. Then the employee might also request to meet with you to talk about, well, all vacancies and ask you to disclose all your vacancies, and talk about particular options, which is redeployment or leaving, all those type of things. And then when they express an interest, if they have the relevant skills necessary or you think that they will, then you would have to interview them if they say, well, there's a vacant role that I'm interested in. So it's not automatic interview, which is what is in the health professionals. We still try to connect it to they have to have the required skills, because previous feedback was, well, you don't want to set an employee up thinking that they're going to have a job to go for an interview and waste everyone's time. So we still did make a connection to talk about, you know, that they'd reasonably have the skills to be able to do that job. Then you would require them to go through an interview process. So the next part is wages and related matters. So wages, super, payment of wages and various allowances. So now I'm going to go back to the wage rates and what was actually a deal in the enterprise agreement, taking into account like the earlier background about the ERO. So what we've done is we applied the ERO 6 months early in July instead of December. So what that means is it's being brought forward 6 months, so you don't have to keep doing July, December, it's in July. So although it had a cost aspect to it, it did simplify the process. The next part is the additional increment for SACS level 1 to 5, commencing in July 2017. So I call that element 2. So element 2 is for those people that translate to those levels, which I do have on the next slide, and it was worth $17.50. And where that $17.50 came from was the ASU was seeking health professionals' public sector rates. Well, we looked at, okay, well, what did health professionals in community health centres get last time round? And they got an extra increment worth $17.50. So that's where that amount comes to. Obviously, because of the complexities that I described earlier with the pre-mon, mon award and ERO added on top, it doesn't equate to $17.50, it will equate to slightly less if your pre-mon award was higher, or slightly more where your mon award is higher because you've got the ERO on top of that. So yeah, just in case you fielded calls from people at the time saying, oh, but this said $17.50. It didn't. It did, but it didn't in terms of how you calculate that. And then again, indexation in line with the Fair Work annual wage review. So why we did that instead of, say, setting a 3% increase ongoing is we don't know what the Fair Work Commission will do. So if we had have set rates, you would have had a schedule in the back and you would have had to have continued to compare this EBA with modern award rates. Which is what you currently did in the 2013 agreement. In this agreement, because we've relied on the minimum wage, we know at all times people will be at or above minimum wages. So for 6 months of the time, the people that only get element 1, which is basically the people that only get element 1 is 6 to 8. 1 to 5 will get the 2 elements. So the 1 to 5 will always be above when they're at the top increment. So it's so you don't have an extra layer, basically. So this slide just outlines the different additional pay points. So there was only 3 pay points in the level 1, now it's a pay point 4. Again, ERO doesn't apply to that. The level 2 previously was a pay point 4, is now pay point 5. The level 3, previously a pay point 4, now level 5, and so on. So what's important in regards to the wage rates is that you shouldn't go back to the enterprise agreement by itself because it interacts in the same way that the modern award does. It's got base rates, which the ERO applies on top of it, and what you would call the EBA ERO order applies on top of it. So make sure that you go to our salary circulars to look at the pay rate that's actually due under their EBA, which is Salary Circular 705. Now you also may have a translation that is not covered in the salary circular. So it's important that if you don't, and you can have something fall out, so don't think, oh no, we have to match something up to match the modern award. You may have different, the EBA, you may have a different translation. So if you do, you can contact us and we have a background spreadsheet that we can show you how you are to calculate them and work that out. So just making sure that you don't have to just make sure it fits. In terms of existing staff, there was a maintenance provision that we did for wage rates. So sometimes, depending on your translation, which it usually occurs maybe if you translate people to like a SACS level 3, usually is where I found it occurs, that the EBA, the new EBA based on the wage rates might be lower than the previous enterprise agreement. So when you've got an existing person and they're getting paid under the old EBA and that's higher than the new EBA, you still have to maintain that. That stays in place until this EBA eventually goes over. And I think there's some people that might not get an increase until like the last year of their agreement, and I'm not sure how many people had to field calls on that, but I think that's probably where you would have fielded most of your calls in terms of the back pays, the people that didn't actually receive much back pay or none at all. And then also we put a clause in there that outlined the trainees are paid in accordance with the training wage in the Miscellaneous Award 2010. Previously it wasn't really clear what you paid trainees, but we wanted to make sure it's clear that terms and conditions are under the agreement, but the wage rates come from the training wage award. So you don't refer to the EBA for that, you go to the trainee wage in that award. The next one is superannuation choice, which is a big one that we got asked to put in. There's super choice. It's obviously by agreement with the employer and it still has to be a complying fund. But it's definitely a super choice. Then the next one is clarity that parental leave, the paid parental leave attracts superannuation. Previously it kind of did say paid leave gets superannuation, but we just put it as a cherry on top to say, well, we made it clear that paid parental leave attracts superannuation, because under the superannuation law, unless your agreement provides it, you don't actually have to pay it. But most of our EBAs are transitioning to that approach. Some are different and only do it for, say, the long parental leave, but under this agreement it's for the long parental leave or the short parental leave, which I think it's either 10 weeks and 1. I can't remember, it hasn't changed, but the super part we've just made clearer. The next one is payment of wages. So it talks about fortnightly wage payments, which people would be doing. The next one is the different payments of time frames, which will depend on how the termination is occurring. So previously we had feedback where people wanted to say, well, it's all your pay is left to when your normal pay period, essentially, which is not something that we could agree to or put in for all circumstances, but we were able to separate it to say, well, if you're terminating an employee, you have to pay the 4 weeks or 4 weeks in lieu of notice, basically straight away on the day that you terminate. Now that's because the NES says you can't terminate someone unless they've actually been paid their notice. So you can't get out of the NES entitlement saying you have to pay that. But the notice has to be paid, but all other things like your long service leave and that kind of stuff, or redundancy, that gets paid in your next pay schedule. And then with someone that, say, resigns of their own violation or any other circumstance, then it is in your next pay period after the termination. So there is that slight distinction where you're terminating them and paying the notice out. The other thing to note is it does say you can mutually agree to some other arrangement, because we understand that there's things related to, say, superannuation that takes a while to organise, and the employee might want to delay that so they can get that organised. So again, if you're mutually agreeing to something, make it clear in writing what you're agreeing to. Allowances is the next one. There's a bunch there, and what it is that we've again indexed it in line with the Fair Work Commission. The first increase is in 2016, July each year. We did have to do some undertakings for the meal allowance, so again that's just a reference to make sure you look at the salary circular. I'm not sure how many people have people doing overtime for meal allowances, but they were like $12 something compared to $10. So the next one is hours and related work. We actually didn't make too many changes as a result of the bargaining, but there are actually a lot of undertakings that were all required through the assessment that the Fair Work Commission did. So the first one is undertakings in relation to the maximum ordinary hours. So previously the agreement talked about a process where you could work out a majority of employees and do 12-hour shifts for, I think, youth workers. Under the modern award, you can only do a maximum of 10, and anything above that is overtime. So we had to keep it in line with that. Now, this doesn't stop you from doing an individual flexibility arrangement for, better off all overall purposes for someone requesting for you to work a particular work arrangement, but your normal standard shifts or normal work arrangements that you give people can't be more than 10 hours. It's overtime after that. We also did, I'm not going to go through the next two because I don't think there's many people that have this type of work, but broken shifts and excursions, the modern award is quite different in relation to how the entitlements are to be paid. So what employers essentially have to do is make sure they look at the undertaking, calculate what people would receive as a result of the undertaking, then calculate what people would receive as a result of the EBA, and you pay whichever's the greater. So yeah, that was just the easiest way that we could deal with it because people have so many different camps, some of them might have different excursions, and it's too hard to actually pinpoint to put one idea behind that. So it will cause payroll a bit of grief, but we saw that as kind of the only option that we could do, and we couldn't argue that they were better off because there's so many different arrangements. The next one is the sleepover, which I will go over because I think a few more people have sleepovers compared to the other ones, but there's now a process for a refusal of a sleepover, which is really they have to give you 7 days notice and with reasonable cause. The sleepover period has to be for a continuous period of not less than 6 and not more than 8. So the modern award says 8, but we were able to get 6 in there, but you can't have, say, a period of 10 hours sleepover. When work is required, the previous agreement used to say, well, when you do 1 hour's work, that compensates you for 1 hour's of overtime. You can't do that anymore. You get your sleepover allowance, and then if you work an hour or whatever you work, say even if you work 30 minutes, you're entitled to an additional 1 hour minimum payment. Whereas before it was the allowance that covers 1 hour's work. See you later if you do under 1 hour. But now it is where you get your 1 hour's plus your allowance. And then the other one is minimum rostered amount before and after the sleepover. So that is 4 hours. So you basically have to have either a 4-hour shift at the end or a 4-hour shift at the start. You've got to make sure one period is for 4 hours at least. Then there's also the introduction of a new shift. Now this shift is similar to what you might have in other agreements like the Health and Allied. Don't think many people do shifts, but it's a morning shift allowance basically. So the night shift payment is payable when someone commences a shift before 6 a.m. It previously wasn't in there, but it's in the modern award, so we couldn't really get away with much, especially because there's really not that much of a barrier between these rates and what the EBA rates are. So the next one is overtime. So with the overtime, again, we just updated that to take into account the part-time hour change that we described earlier. For overtime rate on a Sunday, that's double time. I think it was time and a half. Time off in lieu, it just makes it clear when you have an arrangement with a staff member that says, okay, well, you accrue time and you can take it later. Most people, I think, were doing it, but it's just making it clear that if they do terminate and they haven't taken that time, you have to pay that out on termination. And then again, if the hours are in excess of 10 hours, it's it's overtime. Recall to work was another undertaking that we were required, and this is about when someone's on call and they're recalled. If they return to the workplace to do recall, they have to have a minimum payment of 2 hours. But still, like if they're called, you can still keep it at 1 hour because the EBA is 1 hour. But the Commission said to us, well, you need to put 2 hours. We said, well, we think 2 hours is okay for coming back to work and doing duties, but over the phone, we don't think that MON award applies, so we want to apply 1 hour. So we were able to keep a difference, but you do, if they come back to work, you have to pay a minimum too. So that's a payroll matter. So leave and public holidays is where we've got all our leave provisions. So a new one is the annual leave close down, which is again similar to the health professionals. It's really about a process of informing employees about your annual leave close down. So you may close down part or all of your service. This still allows you to do that. And when you decide to close down, there's a notification time frame in writing, which is either on commencement, because some people start halfway through a year or wherever, or before 15 of November each year. You've got to notify people about your close down. And then where employees don't want to utilise leave, they've got to also notify you, and you have discussions. So that notification is meant to occur by the 1st of December. And what you would do is you're required to meet to talk about options and trying to resolve the dispute locally. So that might be talking about, well, making sure hours of work are directed to when you've actually got clients. Do they have excessive leave? Is there time in lieu available, or is there overtime? And then if you can't actually resolve it, you still have to have the discussion. If you can't resolve it from the discussions, then you would follow the dispute resolution process. We did improve this further in the health professionals in terms of what's disputed. It's not as clear in here, but really it's trying to work out, we would say it's about trying to work out, well, is the request to take the leave reasonable if, say, they don't have any leave and that kind of thing, or is them saying no, is that reasonable in itself? Going through those type of things is what we think. Management of excessive leave. So this is a process of, the agreement didn't really talk about how you manage leave, and then there was also the MON award when it comes to excessive. So what we've got in the agreement is a blend between what we tried to get in for employers, but still some of the stuff in the MON award, sorry. So what you would do is you'd be requesting a meeting with an employee, but the employee can also request a meeting with you about taking their excessive leave. Excessive leave is 8 weeks or more. And really what you meet to discuss is a reasonable opportunity for the employee to reduce the leave to 6 weeks within 3 months. So you want them to come back to you with a plan of how to take their leave in the next 3 months. And it also has a process about outlining that you won't unreasonably refuse. So that might be that they say, well, look, I can't take it within, the next 6 months. I want to take it within the next 12 months because I've got a planned leave holiday, and that's when I'll take it. And then when there is no agreement, then you can direct them to take leave. And then there are some extra little bits in there about the process of how the Commission can deal with the dispute, and that might be saying, well, have you actually tried to reach an agreement before coming to the Commission? Have you generally tried to resolve it? As some of the things that they'll be able to decide if it goes to the Commission. So there are some clauses on that as well. The leave loading, we did amend the max leave loading amount to a specified amount. Previously it was based on some male average that was always difficult to find. So we actually took the amount that we did find, we put it into a specified amount, and it's increased in line with the Fair Work wages. Again, it's the first increase is in 2016. From an NES point of view, we did delete, and this isn't relevant to the leave loading as such, but generally the annual leave, it previously said you had to have a certain amount of days single that was capped, which is not in the NES, so we had to delete that capping, and it's really about making sure that someone's request is not unreasonably refused. You can't just have a blanket rule that says you're only allowed to take 5 single days. So that's been removed. You have to look at it on an as needs basis as the applications come up in terms of refusing or allowing the leave to occur. The next one is cashing out of annual leave. So that's a new clause that wasn't in there. So that allows flexibility that if an employee wants to, they can cash out their leave. Again, most of this is NES, the first 3 points. So must have 4 weeks annual leave retained, must be agreed in writing, and must be paid the full amount that they would have been paid. So that's, for example, super and leave loading. So that doesn't magically disappear. It's still paid. The next one is just making sure that when you do get a request, that you consider, well, how much leave have they had? If they haven't had enough in the last, few years, there might be a serious OHS concern that no, you can't cash it out. You need to take your leave, or okay, well, they're at 6 weeks, but we know in 6 months they're going to take 2. You're not going to have much of a balance to take particular leave later on down the track. So it's just making sure you're looking at those things when you're doing a request, because usually unions say, well, we only want you to cash out 2 weeks. Well, we say, well, this covers the relevant clause where you're just making sure it's a balanced consideration to when you get a request. But you can't make someone take it. It's up to them to make that choice and request it. So the next one is purchase leave. So there were just some slight changes with that, which is making it clear that someone has to apply every 12 months for a purchase leave application. And then also, if you do refuse it, that it's provided in writing. So again, purchase leave is similar to the transition to retirement, where it's not an entitlement that says you can it can't be unreasonably refused. It talks about flexibility. It's an option for, but there's no way to dispute, well, I have to get it. But this provides a bit of transparency to someone that, your leave isn't going to be, your leave is rejected because of X, X, X. And usually with transparency, people are usually understand a little bit more about the decision being made and can accept it. So that's where that comes from. And every 12 months is really about making sure it's not just always one person that gets it every year and all the same, and it's not kind of balanced out. So that was somewhere in the middle that we met with the union. The next one is a new transfer of personal/carers leave. This is again one where we're trying to give the employee something that is quite common in other enterprise agreements, which is a transfer of 10 days personal leave, pro rata for part-timers. Now, different to your health and allied and health professionals, it is actually only transferable for those listed in the SACS agreement, which is a little bit different.
I think it's a really good idea because we sometimes struggle with trying to work out under the admin agreement what some of these other organisations are, whether they meet the definitions or not.
Yeah, and long service leave is slightly, this is where I'm getting across agreements is going to be a bit different, because SACS is another kettle of fish, and for sick leave it's something that's not, and transfer of sick leave it's not NES derived, but say for long service leave it's an NES derived entitlement, excluding SACS, where some of those definitions we can't get rid of it, but yeah, they're old definitions, they're out of date, but it's some of them you can't change. But yeah, we made it specific enough that it was only for community health centres, because that's their centres that we're working with. And then we also made it clear that the break is no more than 5 weeks in between employment. And the other one is about providing a certificate of service within 2 weeks of starting. So you can't...
So we've got a person who, I reckon they started about 8 or 9 months ago.
Yep.
I'm still trying to get hold of the certificate of service.
Yeah. So I think we made it quite clear in that it's about a certificate of service. It's not about if they've got it documented on their resume, especially if you've asked. Yeah, I would always recommend if someone doesn't give it to you, don't say, oh, well, we'll wait. You should ask if it is on the resume, but I would say they've lost their time frame, really. They haven't met it. So we just made sure that was clear. The next one is parental leave, which we've made it more gender neutral. In total, we've made the agreement a bit more gender neutral as well, but specifically, obviously, there's a lot of terms in the parental leave that previously are female or male because of the old awards. We've also incorporated various obligations that already exist for adoption and pregnancy, just to make it a bit more wholesome of a clause. And again, it's similar to health professionals, like such as keeping in touch days. They used to no longer be, weren't a part of the NES, became it. And also just talks about how you can flexibly agree on how to pay it, which might be half time, 70% time, whatever works. It just provides you with flexibility to agree on how the payment should be made. The next one is long service leave. So it now deals with pay and what people are to get if they're, like returned to work half or on workers' compensation, that you either get paid the higher of your normal weekly hours before and pay rate before the illness, or before you take your leave. So it's whichever's the greater. So again, you have to do that comparison of what was it when they were injured versus what was it just before long service leave, and pay the greater of those two. There's also a clarity that the employer may offer their discretion, and it's their absolute discretion to agree to long service leave before 10 years. The previous agreement had a sentence that didn't quite make it clear, but we made it clear that people, it's not like an option for someone to request it. It's actually, they can request it, but it's at your discretion. It's not the employee's total right, or it's not subject to operational requirements. So we made that clearer. And look, I don't know if anyone was going to ask me today, but I'm not prepared for it. I don't know how this all interacts with the long service leave portability stuff. That's still a work in progress, and I think we're now going to get involved in the group that's kind of happening. So, but as things develop, previously we weren't heavily involved in it, but we are going to get involved in it now because we've had a few questions about that. But through the submissions, we did raise, because the Commission did raise some issues about how long service leave and how it interacts, and this doesn't meet the 7-year rule. We did provide submissions, and we put copies of that on the app, and we said, well, we think it's a better off entitlement overall, so it doesn't matter. But either way, we think you can still approve it, and they didn't give us any direction about, well, I agree with this but don't agree with that. They just approved it. So for us, we're going based on, we think the whole long service leave clause is a better entitlement, therefore the Long Service Leave Act doesn't apply, but there could be an argument where someone says you get the better of both worlds, basically.
But that would be the same for all the agreements that have better provisions, and they've approved them all. So.
Yeah, it's slightly different, and the difference between the SACs and, say, your allied health professionals is that the SACs pre-modern award actually said for, say, community health centres, you get a state-based entitlement, versus your allied health professionals or your nurses or your health and allied, there was actually a pre-modern award that said your long service leave is this, and it's only at 10 years. So that's where you've got a distinction between an NES-derived entitlement and a state-based entitlement. So where something doesn't meet an NES derived entitlement, technically the Commission can hold it up, tell you to do an undertaking. But if it's a state-based entitlement, there's no stopping, there's nothing, they don't have any power to stop you agreeing. There was a decision on that part. So we're going on the basis of, we think it's a better entitlement. So, but people may still claim that, and it would have to go to dispute to get it actually sorted if it was going to then go to arbitration. But because it was specifically raised, we're still putting upon our normal opinion. And we did do a bulletin on long service leave that talked about interaction. We did run it past the ASU, and we said, just putting it run, consulting with the unions. If there's any problems, give us a call. Followed them up 2 times, nothing, crickets. So they didn't say that they agreed, but they didn't say that they don't agree, which is reserving their rights, obviously, I think. Then the next few slides are on professional development leave, study leave and exam leave. So professional development leave is new. So it provides a definition of what professional development leave is, and it's similar to the nurses agreement, because we've had calls before where it's not clear between, well, what's PD leave, what's study leave, and how they're kind of separated. So there's a clearer definition that's similar to the nurses agreement, which talks about the PD life cycle and all those type of things. It's 5 days pro rata for part-time employees. Then there's also an application process, which is 6 weeks before the date. They need to provide you with the date of it and also the relevance to work. And then the response process is it mustn't be unreasonably refused. So this is one where it could go to the dispute over if you have refused or not. And it's a 7-day time frame for you to respond. And then also, again, providing the reasons for the refusal. Now, they're in a similar format when you come to study leave. So when study leave can be used, which is really about a course, when they're going to undertake a course related to their employment. We probably could improve that, I think, in the next one, but we still try to make a distinction between PD and a particular course that you're doing. The amount is as mutually agreed, so there's no set amount. The application process is similar, relevance of details.
So I know there's no set amount, as you said. I'm just wondering, is there still some sort of rough guide?
Well, there isn't a rough guide, but there is, which is the next point, is that there's the consideration of the application. So the agreement does talk about relevant factors that you'd consider when you've got an application, which might talk about your employee's length of service, their level of study. So the amount of study that you're going to give to someone that's doing, say, a Cert 3 or Cert 4 compared to someone that might be doing a tertiary degree is going to be different. Plus also how many hours are they doing, you know, full time. Part-time, you want 5 hours off every week, well, you're never going to be here. And you're never going to be able to get your work done versus someone that is full-time. So it gives you a little bit of guidance in terms of, well, look at these things when you've got an application process, but it doesn't say all these 5 things equate to this balance, which means you get 5 weeks. Oh, sorry, not 5 weeks. I'm going well above what the amount is, but yeah, whatever that is, depending on the situation. So yeah, but that might be something that we put in the review phase of the agreement in terms of setting amount if people want that clarity versus a bit of flexibility. It depends.
It'd be nice to have a bit of a guide on it.
Yeah, yeah. And then the response process, again, 7-day time frame and reasons for refusal. That also, it's not unreasonably refused. So again, that's just flexibility. It's not something that they can go to the commission on and say, well, you haven't agreed to it. Then the next one is the exam leave. So it just makes it clear that the exam leave is connected to the study leave. The old EBA wasn't actually clear and said you get exam leave. We've made sure that it's connected to the study leave, and we also made sure it was 6 days a year. Before, it wasn't clear in terms of accumulating and all that type of stuff. I didn't put it on the slide, but it is pro rata again. And in all of the clauses, we provide clarity. It's paid at your base rate. It doesn't accumulate from year to year. And there's also a clause regarding how you consider what's a course is relevant. So again, similar to the nurses, where it talks about, you know, relevant to the profession, relevant to how it's going to assist their job. You've got to look at all those things when you do consider, is it relevant or not? The next one is public holiday payments. So we did amend the Easter Saturday payment for when people don't work on the day. They usually, people that work Monday to Friday, got an entitlement, part-time and full-time. We tried to get rid of it, weren't successful, but we did change it to make it so it only applies to full-timers, which we don't think there are as many full-timers compared to part-timers. So it should have reduced in terms of that payment, but I'm also not sure how many employees actually worked Monday to Friday either, but we did definitely reduce that. Couldn't get rid of it, but reduce that liability for payment. And then we also had to do another undertaking in terms of there is that provision where someone gets your normal 100%, but they can take the penalty, 150 at time in lieu. Again, time in lieu if it's not taken and they terminate, paid out. so they don't lose it. It's not a case of you don't take it, you lose it, you still receive it. The next one is the family violence. So with the family violence, we actually did a lot of consultation on that clause with community health centres. We know that there were a lot of people that had some policies already in place. And I know some of this would have been talked about in the Health and Allied, and I think there were some questions as well, which obviously we'll take on board. That you've got the 20 days paid family violence leave, casuals are unpaid, that someone can also access it for someone in their household or family member who's experiencing family violence. They can access personal leave in particular circumstances. So what's important is that this clause doesn't just replicate public sector. We did tailor it a lot. I think in the public sector it's quite open in relation to what circumstances you can be supporting someone to take carers leave, to take personal leave, but we've actually got in there specified circumstances. So, I mean, you can obviously, because I know most members have got nurses and a party to that, you can still apply them, but you know, it's a little bit stricter, this one, or it provides a little bit more protection for employers in regards to some things. Like, I don't have it on the slide, but you know, taking into account performance measures, it's a bit better from the employer part, whereas I think the nurses agreement is kind of a bit like you can't really touch someone on family violence leave, but if there are like serious things that are happening, our employers wanted to be covered, that you know, you may need to still terminate someone. Obviously you're going to be very, very supportive, but there might be a point in time which comes that you need to make a decision on employment because they're not meeting the inherent requirements of the job. But obviously we understand that people are going to be supportive in the first instance, but we can't say just because you're experiencing that we can't do anything with you. We can, but we've got to take into account all the circumstances. And then there's also development of internal support arrangements. So that is things such as your contact point, and then also reasonable safety measures and implementing some of those. So I think Daniel did mention there is a guide on the public sector one. We don't have a guide on the community health centre one, but it does also help in regards to some of those measures, or how do you deal with disclosures from people, how do you record it on your payroll, because confidentiality is an important thing. So if you're looking for some of those, there is the public sector guide that might be able to help with that stuff.
Where would we find that?
That's on MyIR and then also the community app if you go to the relevant group and on the relevant landing page of the EBA. That can, and it's a good read also. And there's, I don't know if there's got links on that, but there's also a podcast that we did on family violence, and yeah, with the women's, which is really insightful and really interesting to watch. So you just go to our video links page. So there's a few, although it's in relation to public sector, some of it is transferable and that kind of thing. And yeah, it's definitely an interesting watch, and I'd recommend that. The next one is the classification and progression clauses. So the modern award descriptors have been inserted. People should be familiar with them because people through this whole process should be making sure that they're paying minimum wages. So whereas previously it was the pre-modern award that was in the EBA. So we've translated it over, but because of the ERO, we still have to do the notional translation. And what we did, just to make it clear, because we didn't want to change the scope, because some of the descriptors in the modern award are quite open to interpretation. We made sure that we kept the definitions of what social work is, what welfare work is, what community development work is, and what youth work is, because the modern award doesn't have them, but to provide guidance so we know that it's not going to change, we kept those in there. So they're not at the front, they are at the back. That's just to look at. But yeah, again, we can't get away from the pre-modern award yet, which is what you had in your old EBA, but we will at the end of the ERO. That's why we based everything on the modern award. We base the wage rates on it. So when 2020 December comes, it's the modern award. You only have to do 2. Whereas if we had have done it based on, say, the pre-modern award, you still would have had 2 layers. So now you'll only have 1 layer once the ERO. So we've still got a bit to go, but it's getting there. And then the last one that we changed was the progression part of it. Now the agreement, old agreement already had a clause about it, about where you could hold someone back subject to performance and the acquisition of skills. Not all employers used it, so we made it clear that it's if it's required by the employer. We also provided some clarity around what continuous service was. It excludes unpaid leave. So if someone takes 6 months off, you don't count that 6 months. And also in relation to a casual, there wasn't clarity about, well, how do you deal with a casual? So we put in there that if you don't have a week where you're working, then obviously like unpaid, it's equivalent to unpaid leave, basically. So, because otherwise they're treated unfairly they're treated more fairly compared to your part-timers or your full-timers. So that's just helps provide some information there. And the last one is that, the third dot point is that if someone is at risk of not progressing, there is a process that you need to undertake. And the process is really saying to that employee, your performance isn't right, it needs to improve, and you would include how it needs to improve, and that, you know, if you don't improve, you're not progressing. If you don't do that process, then you're going to be found to unreasonably refuse someone progressing. So it's just making sure those steps are in place to be telling the employee, and at the end you can say, well, we gave you the best chance possible, you knew you needed to perform to do that, get that increment. There's also a clause in there that just kind of says, well, you don't have to do the appraisals if you don't want to, no obligation to. And then if an appraisal isn't done after the 12 months, if you do it at 14 months, you still have to make sure you back pay whatever that balance is from when you did it, because there are some employers that do it at one particular year for all, like in a particular point for all staff. So they don't want to have to do single ones every 12 months and manage them all differently. So that was just why that was done, just to take into account people like to either do it collectively or every 12 months. And then that's kind of the end, unless people have questions. I think with the SACs, obviously it was a bit late, so I did get a lot of implementation questions on the wages at the time, and I know there was probably a lot of hair pulling out, which I totally understand. But yeah, thanks for implementing that. It was still not a lot of questions, so I'm pretty, you should be proud of what you've done. I wasn't bugged as much as what I thought I would be. Yeah. So if anybody does have any queries after today, they can just email the query inbox through our query framework that we've got as well. Thank you for coming.